All right, let's look over a couple of things we've already looked at. Remember, even if a saying or reported deity of Jesus does not pass the test of historical critical criteria, in other words, Jesus most likely did not actually say this or do this, scholars may consider such references in the Gospels as having some measure of historical validity. Also, recall the Synoptic Problem and the theoretical document of Q, or the Gospel of Q. Q is essentially the solution to this synoptic problem, which we looked at. I won't take time to go over this again. You can look at it again. How to account for the similarity between the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then why certain Gospels, Matthew and Luke, for example, differ from Mark, and some of the other big questions that emerged about 175 years ago. Why is there, for example, no Sermon on the Mount in Mark's Gospel? And again, Mark's Gospel is considered to be the earliest written Gospel, around the year 70 CE. Matthew and Luke considered to be written probably around 85 to 90, and John from 90 to around the year 100, or the turn of the century. So these are some of the things that the synoptic problem brings up, and the stipulated theorized document of Q helps to solve. And we looked at this. Now, here's a summary chart of the 2 or now 4 documentary hypotheses. And it's been updated since Holtzmann's 19th century version. Kloppenborg, for example, has his revised edition. So Mark represents one of the sources for both Matthew and Luke. Q represents the other source in the 2 documentary hypothesis source for Matthew and Luke. And then later, other sources were considered. In other words, Matthew had some information sources that were collected by him and his community. Luke also had some special material that he incorporated in his gospel that was not found in either Mark or Matthew. Again, if Mark is written earlier than both Matthew and Luke, then that would exclude it anyway. Notice Q is speculated to be a written Greek document in the mid-40s, so very early on. We have some written material that would have been incorporated or used as a source. Let's look at a famous sermon from Q. Again, this sermon is not found in Mark because, again, if we follow this theory, Mark did not have Q as a source, even though Mark wrote after Q. But somehow Luke and Matthew did have a copy of Q, or sayings of Jesus, mostly sayings of Jesus. So notice Matthew's version and Luke's version. Scholars usually write something that they designate as Q as Matthew Q, or just Q5, 1 and 2 in this case, or Q 17 rather. And usually if you only find Q16, 6, 17, a reference like that, it is a reference to Luke, because scholars also think that Luke had the most original version of the Q material. So now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. we just look at the first couple of verses. Notice Luke's version. Jesus went down, not up, with them and stood on a level place, on a mountainside. And a large crowd of his disciples was there, and a great number of people from all over Judea and Jerusalem and from the coastal region around Tyre and Sidon. Now, so essentially, we're dealing with this Q material that both Matthew and Luke are already redacting. It goes on, blessed or Makarios, probably the best way to interpret that is how honored in God's eyes, not literally blessed. So how honored in God's eyes are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Luke, a more original version of the Q document, says how blessed or how honored in God's eyes are you who are poor. So most likely scholars would say that Luke is the more original version, that Jesus of Nazareth statement is closer. In other words, how honored in God's eyes are the poor. The word for poor there, patochos in Greek, is the word for destitutely poor. There's another word in Greek, penes, which is simply the working poor. So Jesus is, again, challenging the cultural, societal value of those who are destitutely poor, that somehow they're honored in God's eyes. Many people would have thought that if you are destitutely poor, you must have offended God or one of the gods. So again, this is interesting. Matthew adds, apparently, poor in spirit for his urban congregation in most likely Antioch in Syria, the third largest city in the Greco-Roman world at the time. Poor in spirit. Well, that you can be poor in spirit if you're destitutely poor, certainly, but it expands the meaning to include everybody who even is psychologically down. Now, is Matthew's addition something that invalidates or completely tramples on Jesus's original teaching of blessed are the poor? Again, thinking of the people that are poor most likely because of Roman policies of taxation and just the harsh environment of and the life of trying to support a peasant family. Well, that's a judgment call. It's an example, however, for us to see that Matthew is using this tradition to resonate with his urban community in Antioch. There may not have been that many destitutely poor in Matthew's congregation. So this is an example. You can read the rest of this famous sermon, Matthew's version and Luke's version. Notice they are very, very similar. And it goes on, and Matthew extends it in his version. Now, note how Jesus begins his mission, the context of the message and teaching. So what might be considered controversial in that culture at the time? Well, if you notice Matthew 4, beginning with verse 12, Jesus is selecting disciples. He leaves his own village of Nazareth, which would have been, again, quite controversial. Sons do not leave their fathers to fend for themselves or families. And Jesus calls disciples. The early disciples, according to Matthew, are Peter and Andrew, James, and John. They were part of fishing families. Fishing families were quite poor, and they weren't like middle class contractors. And he calls them away from their families. In fact, there's a provocative statement that Jesus called James and John, and they left their father standing in the boat. Well, poor Mr. Zebedee, their dad, had to, if you follow the story, was left to do the rest of the work, the hard labor, on his own. If his two sons traipsed on off after Jesus, so this is something that would have really stuck out to an audience in the first century. Jesus leaving his own village to go do this kingdom of God thing, making really a hardship on his family, and most would think. And these four early disciples leaving their fathers and their families in the arduous task of fishing for a living. You can look at those texts as well. Now, how would this be understood in context? Well, it would be shameful for sons to leave fathers. Jesus left his village. Was his father dead? I don't think so. But so Jesus leaves. James and John, Peter and Andrew, they leave. Other disciples will leave, including some women disciples, as we'll see. So the father kin group, the village and village elders, would have had a dim view of sons like Jesus leaving the family. Notice this text, interesting text out of Deuteronomy from the Hebrew Bible, chapter 21, verses 18 through 23. Using cultural anthropology or social science, this phenomena is considered labeling, or it's labeled labeling. Notice that the text refers to, it deals with rebellious sons. And here we see a political structure of hierarchy or patriarchy. It refers to father and mother, and village elders. So, for example, out of Deuteronomy, if someone has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders at the gate of his town. They shall say to the elders, "This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and drunkard." Then all the men of his town are to stone him to death. You must purge the evil from among you. All Israel will hear of it and be afraid. Now, what's interesting about this, and by the way, later Jewish scholars don't necessarily believe, or biblical scholars, that this was taken literally, that lazy children or sons were literally taken outside of the city gate and stoned to death. Maybe they were, but it's simply an admonition or a way of accentuating the need for sons to be obedient, and the structure of a village where village leaders or elders have such authority. But notice in the Gospels, Matthew and Luke. First Matthew, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So apparently in Jesus' ministry, he was labeled as a glutton and a drunkard. Now, I would assume that most Jews would have been familiar with the admonition in Deuteronomy. To label someone as a glutton and drunkard is to label them as rebellious or a no account, to marginalize someone. So Jesus is essentially saying he's being marginalized by certain people. Then again in Luke chapter 7, verse 34, the Son of Man came eating and drinking. By the way, remember, Son of Man is an Aramaic expression. It simply means a human being like me. So the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So we have these two texts that certainly fit a certain criteria of authenticity. They're actually embarrassments, right? Who would want to admit that Jesus or the later Christians as the Messiah or the Son of God was actually called a glutton and a drunkard? Again, it's based upon his open table fellowship, his eating with everyone, tax collectors and sinners, again, which would have been a source of embarrassment, and it would have been a source of consternation to many. And this labeling, reminiscent of the admonition or the text in Deuteronomy that tells the community, such sons, if they are disobedient, not honoring their father, are in fact to be marginalized, if not killed. Now, according to social anthropology, calling Jesus a glutton and a drunkard amounts again to labeling or marginalizing. We do it in our culture to a degree too. You know, unfortunately, it happens at the highest places of our political institutions. Politicians labeling each other and trying to marginalize or discredit them. In that culture, it was much more impactful, I would suggest. Labels marginalized, ostracized, demonized certain people so as to make them no longer thought to be a part of a fictive kin group or their own family. And again, we have this from the Gospels. So, what is the social significance? Well, again, similar to what we have in any culture or society when people are marginalized. They are placed outside of the group's acceptance. They suffer because of it. They're not included in terms of economic opportunities. They are certainly given a sense of their being at a distance, not let in. They're always feeling under the gun or under the scrutiny of the society at large. By the way, here's a place that has been developed, believed to be where John the Baptist had his ministerial headquarters in the wilderness. So analyze the following text. In other words, we begin by contextualizing, putting it in the original culture and history. Is there a ritual involved? Recalling that this is a polyphasic culture. Where is it happening? What time? What could possibly be the social significance? For example, a ritual meal again. Is this person a prophet, an ascetic prophet, someone like John the Baptizer, a disciple, etc.? And then apply the historical critical test of authenticity, which we've gone over. And also try to identify the theological significance or meaning for these Gospels. In other words, the text that I want you to look at and apply this exercise are in Matthew, the 3rd chapter, Mark, the 1st chapter, Luke, the 3rd chapter, beginning with verse 21, and the 4th Gospel, or the Gospel of John, chapter 1, 29 through 34. Look at these texts, try to answer the 3 questions, and then also note how these texts differ, and see if you can find some reason or significance for the differences or what the differences might suggest to us. Here are these texts, so you don't have to flip around in your New Testaments, although I would suggest you get used to navigating your way through the Gospels. It will come in handy when you're doing exercises and taking quizzes and text. But here are these four pericopes or sections of passages that you can look at and compare. Just for example, notice in the first one, Matthew 3, verse 16, at the very end, there's a voice from heaven, and it said, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Notice Mark, verse 11, and a voice from heaven, no problem there, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." So notice the difference between the two. This is my Son, you are my Son. Again, Luke, you are my Son, and John has a longer passage. But the question would be for us, does this represent a historical event? And again, if we follow the criteria of authenticity, yes, we have it in independent sources. We have it very similar wording as the event of Jesus's baptism and the ritual of Jesus' baptism is certainly a polyphasic. People are experiencing something, hearing something in that culture, and it has the mark of embarrassment because it is John baptizing Jesus. And remember, that would have indicated in that culture that John was somehow superior. Well, let's move on. Roman economics in Palestine, which were devastating to most Jews, especially obviously the majority, the peasants who lived there. Roman occupation of Palestine established an imperium, in other words, the emperor's rule through his client kings like the Herods. And they were to do the bidding, even though they were considered Jewish, they were still doing the bidding of the emperor, like the Sadducees in the temple in Jerusalem. We think of urbanization, in other words, or commercialization. So one thing that Rome did was to build cities, model cities in Palestine or Israel as a standard bearer or propaganda for the glory that was Rome. For example, Sepphoris, only 3.5 miles from where Jesus grew up in Nazareth, was one such city created and developed, built by Rome, occupied mostly by Jews, but nonetheless a standard city from which Rome could propagate its glory, its gospel, if you will. Another one, Tiberius, ruled and governed in these areas by the Herods or the Herodians, and the temple priest in Jerusalem. So urbanization, commercialization was one way that Rome colonized people, and this urbanization and commercialization, while benefiting the rich collaborators with Rome, was devastating to the common Jew. The economy was an extractive economy. In other words, the wealthy, the elite, take from the peasants. A tributary economy, it's sometimes referred to. In other words, whenever you build an urban center, they function like a great vacuum, sucking in all of the resources from surrounding peasant villages. Again, very difficult, making life very difficult for peasant farmers and peasants who are struggling already to make ends meet. And then there's the redistribution. Elites taking the goods and using them for their own political gain and enrichment. So it creates a very bleak, difficult environment for the people of Palestine, which Jesus obviously noticed and addressed. What was his response? Well, we see it in Q 620. Recall that would be Luke 620. We see it in action in these texts, and I would encourage you to look at these texts. Reciprocity came in three types. See if you can determine which was Jesus's form of economic reciprocity. General reciprocity was practiced usually in the family. A son could borrow from a father, and the father does not expect the son to pay back. General reciprocity. Balanced reciprocity. Equal return is expected. If you borrow a bushel of wheat, you're expected to repay a bushel of wheat. And negative reciprocity. This was often used to take advantage of the other. You could loan money knowing that they most likely could not repay, especially with taxation or interest. And then you would be able to, especially the elite who could loan the money, take the land if repayment was not made. Which one, if according to Luke 6:20, 6:27 through 36, did Jesus practice and encourage? So keep these items in mind. It will be important to understand Jesus's economic programs, certainly. And we'll leave it here for